The apartment smelled of old wood and forgotten time. Daniel Breyer set his last box down with a sigh, rubbing the ache from his shoulders as he took in the place he would now call home. It wasn't much, just a single-bedroom unit in an aging Victorian house split into apartments, but it was cheap, and it was his. The landlord, a stiff-lipped man named Mr. Havish, had given little information about the building other than a gruff warning that the walls were thin. Daniel didn't mind. He wasn't much for noise himself. By the time the moon cast its pale light through his bedroom window, he had unpacked enough to sleep. Exhaustion settled over him like a heavy blanket, and within minutes, he drifted off. Then came the sound. It started as a whisper, so faint it could have been mistaken for the rustling of leaves outside. But there were no trees by his window. He stirred but didn't wake. The whisper grew, stretching into something less like a voice and more like a resonance. Not music, not speech. Just something. A vibration, deep and wrong, thrumming just beneath the audible range. At exactly 3:12 a.m., Daniel's eyes snapped open. The sound was there, inside the room. He held his breath, ears straining. It wasn't coming from the ceiling, the walls, or the floor. It wasn't the pipes or the wind. It was in the air itself, pressing against his skull like a thought that didn't belong to him. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. Daniel exhaled, his breath shaky. He told himself it was nothing, his mind adjusting to a new place, the fatigue playing tricks on him. He turned over, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. And yet, as he drifted back to sleep, a single doubt curled into his thoughts like smoke. That was not a sound the world was meant to make. Daniel woke feeling as if something had watched him sleep. He shook off the thought with a bitter laugh, rubbing the back of his neck as he shuffled into the kitchen. The coffee machine sputtered to life, filling the air with the rich scent of caffeine. He tried to push the memory of the sound away, but it clung to him like a damp chill. It wasn't just the sound itself, it was the feeling it left behind, like the remnants of a nightmare that refused to fully fade. By the time he stepped outside, the city was already humming. The apartment was in an old part of town, where the streets twisted unpredictably and the buildings leaned toward each other as if whispering secrets. He barely noticed. The routine of the day, work, lunch, the dull rhythm of life, kept his mind from wandering too much. But the moment he returned home, an unease settled over him. It was nothing obvious, just different. The air inside felt off, as if the space had slightly shifted while he was away, like furniture moved an inch when no one was looking. He forced a breath and locked the door behind him. It was an old house. Old houses creaked, settled, breathed. That night, he went to bed earlier. He would be fine. Until 3:12 a.m. Daniel's eyes flew open. The sound was back. This time, he was awake to hear it properly. It wasn't mechanical, wasn't human, wasn't anything he could name. It was layered, like a voice speaking over itself at different speeds, like wind howling through hollow bone, like something crawling through the air itself. His breath came shallow. He turned his head, slow, terrified. The room was wrong, nothing had changed, and yet everything felt misplaced, as if the walls had shifted when he wasn't looking. The sound wasn't coming from a single place. It was everywhere. He reached for his phone with shaking hands, gripping it like a lifeline. The screen glowed, 3:13 a.m. And then, silence. The air cleared as if nothing had happened. Daniel lay in the dark, heart pounding. His rational mind scrambled for an explanation, but the deeper part of him, the one that whispered of shadows in doorways and unseen things under the bed, knew something was wrong. This wasn't just a noise. It was a presence. And it had noticed him. Daniel did not want to go to bed. Sleep had always been a refuge, a place to escape the weight of the world. But now, his own bedroom felt like a waiting trap. He told himself he was imagining things. That it was some trick of acoustics, the house shifting in the night. Maybe the neighbors were up late, their voices blending into some weird auditory illusion. Except he knew that wasn't true. He had checked with the other tenants earlier that day, casually, without letting on his real concerns. The old woman across the hall had smiled politely, her cloudy eyes unfocused as she murmured, "Thin walls, yes. But it's always been quiet at night. Not much to hear." Not much to hear. Daniel had forced a nod, but inside, the words coiled tight. Something was wrong with this place. Still, he had to sleep. Tonight, he left the lamp on, its warm glow spilling across the room. He set his phone on the nightstand, opened a white noise app, and let the artificial hum fill the air. Then he waited. And waited. His eyelids grew heavy. Maybe this would work. Maybe the sound wouldn't come if. 3:12 a.m. The room inhaled. That was the only way to describe it, like the very space around him sucked in a breath. The air pulled tight, thick and unnatural, the pressure shifting in his ears. The white noise from his phone stuttered, warping into something broken. Daniel sat up, his pulse hammering. The sound was here again. Only now, it was closer. Not everywhere at once this time, but focused, concentrated. Right outside his bedroom door. His breath hitched. His apartment was small, just the bedroom, a short hallway, and the living room beyond. There was nothing outside his door. There should have been nothing. And yet, a faint, rhythmic tap began. Soft, methodical, against the wood. Tap, tap, tap. Daniel's stomach clenched. He wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't hurried, wasn't frantic. It was patient. It knew he was awake. He gripped his phone with damp fingers, the screen glaring in the dark. 3:13 a.m. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. He stared at the door, his throat dry, his entire body screaming for him to move, to do something. And then, the doorknob turned. Not violently. Not in a way that could be brushed off as a draft or settling would. No, it was slow. Deliberate. It twisted halfway, then stopped. Daniel didn't realize he had been holding his breath until the click of the lock echoed in the stillness, and he nearly choked on air. His chest heaved as he scrambled backward in the bed, his phone's light shaking in his trembling grip. Seconds passed. Nothing happened. Then, the knob slowly turned back into place. Click. Silence. Daniel sat frozen, every nerve frayed, the sound of his own heartbeat deafening in his ears. And finally, after what felt like hours, the air in the room exhaled. The pressure lifted. The weight vanished. His phone screen flickered. 3:14 a.m. Daniel did not sleep again that night. Daniel was running on caffeine and fear. The morning after the doorknob had turned, he had nearly bolted from the apartment, sleep-deprived and shaking, convinced that if he stayed a second longer, something would step inside. But in the harsh light of day, his panic felt stupid. The door had stayed locked. Nothing had actually happened. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been tested. Noticed. He spent the entire day outside, wandering through coffee shops, bookstores, even sitting in a crowded park just to be surrounded by the normal, living world. The idea of going home made his skin crawl, but by sunset, exhaustion weighed on him like a lead blanket. He had nowhere else to go. So he returned. The apartment was just as he had left it. Normal. Undisturbed. Empty. But it wasn't. The moment he crossed the threshold, he felt it, the air, just slightly wrong, like stepping into a room where someone had been standing a second before. The kind of presence you couldn't see, but you could feel pressing against your skin. Daniel locked the door. Bolted it this time. He had even picked up a small, rusted knife from a thrift shop on the way back, its handle cold in his pocket. Not that he thought a knife would help against whatever this was, but having it felt better than having nothing. That night, he sat up in bed, fully awake. The white noise app was on again, this time louder. He had a glass of water, his phone, and the knife within reach. He wasn't going to sleep. At least, that was the plan. But exhaustion was stronger than fear. His blinks became longer. His head dipped forward, then jerked back up. His grip on the knife loosened. And then, 3:12 a.m. His ears popped. The air compressed. And the sound returned. Only this time, it wasn't outside the door. It was inside the room. Daniel's blood turned to ice. The noise slithered through the air, too close, too near, the layered frequencies twisting and curling around his skull. It wasn't just sound, it was movement. A ripple in the dark, shifting unseen, pressing into the space near his bed. He could feel it. His eyes darted toward the far wall. There was nothing there. But there was. A weight. A shape. A presence. Something standing just beyond sight. His throat clenched, breath coming in shallow gulps. He forced himself not to move, not to blink, not to acknowledge it. Every part of him screamed to turn on the light, to run, but some deeper instinct whispered, "Do not react." The thing in the room was waiting for something. Testing. The sound grew, not louder, but thicker, pressing against his ribs, his skull, his very thoughts. A deep, humming resonance, vibrating at a frequency just below human understanding. Then, something changed. The whispering noise stopped its restless shifting. It focused. It knew he was awake. Daniel clenched his fists, nails biting into his palm. The pressure around him leaned in, as if sniffing, listening. Then, his phone flickered. The light on his nightstand dimmed. The shape at the far wall moved. Not toward him. Toward the mirror. Daniel barely held back a gasp. He hadn't even thought about the mirror. It was old, its frame chipped, something left behind by the previous tenant. It hung on the wall opposite his bed, and now he saw it. The reflection in the glass. There was something there. A dark outline. Tall. Unmoving. Watching him. It wasn't a shadow. Shadows needed light. Daniel's fingers tightened around the knife. His heart pounded, a rising drumbeat of terror. He knew, somehow, that if he moved, if he acknowledged the thing, it would acknowledge him back. The light in his phone flickered again. The pressure in the room quivered, like something adjusting its weight, deciding. And then, the reflection moved. Not the way a person moves. Not the way anything should move. It lagged. Like a badly stitched film reel, a fraction of a second too slow, too jagged, too wrong. And then, without his own reflection moving at all, the dark figure turned to face him. Daniel broke. His hand shot out, smacking the lamp switch. Light flooded the room. The sound vanished. The air snapped back to normal. And the reflection, gone. Daniel sat there, gasping, the knife shaking in his grip. Slowly, shakily, he turned his eyes back to the mirror. It was empty. Just his own pale, terrified face staring back at him. But the glass was fogged over, as if something had breathed against it. And in that condensation, one word had been traced by an unseen hand. Listen. Daniel did not turn off the lights again. He had spent the entire day convincing himself that the message on the mirror had been a hallucination. Sleep deprivation could do strange things to the mind. A trick of condensation, a stray thought manifesting in his half-woken state. But the truth was simpler. Something in this apartment wanted him to listen. And he was terrified of what he might hear. By the time night fell, exhaustion sat on his shoulders like a lead weight, but he refused to sleep. He kept every light on, double-checked the locks, even moved the mirror to face the wall. It didn't matter. 3:12 a.m. would come anyway. And when it did, the sound returned. But tonight, something was different. The air didn't compress this time. The weight didn't press against his chest. Instead, the sound came softly, gentler than before. It was still layered, still unnatural, but there was a strange, almost lulling rhythm to it now. Daniel's stomach turned. The sound was closer to words. It wasn't human, but it was trying to be. Something in the dark was speaking. He squeezed his eyes shut. Do not listen. Do not listen. But the syllables slithered into his ears, bending and shifting like whispers submerged in water. Fragments of meaning scraped against his mind, jagged, incomplete. Knows you, see, hear, open. His hands clamped over his ears. His heartbeat was frantic. This was different. It was escalating. Then, through the sound, another noise joined. A soft, barely audible creak. His bedroom door. It was opening. Daniel's breath hitched. He hadn't heard footsteps. No one had entered. And yet, the door, it was moving. A slow, deliberate inch. Then another. The sliver of hallway beyond was dark, stretching into a void he couldn't bear to look at. Then, A shadow moved. Not in the hallway. In the room. With him. Daniel's body locked up. He didn't want to look. If he didn't look, it wouldn't be real. But instinct overpowered fear. His gaze snapped to the mirror, the one he had turned to face the wall. It was still turned. But now, a reflection moved in it anyway. The dark figure. Standing behind him. And this time, it wasn't just standing. It was leaning closer. Right next to his ear. The whispering sound wasn't in the air. It was in his head. Daniel lunged for the lamp, but before his fingers could reach the switch, the whispering stopped. And in the sudden, deafening silence, a single voice, clear and human, spoke behind him. "You're finally listening." The lights flickered. The air exhaled. Daniel was alone. But the door was now fully open. And beyond it, something was waiting. Daniel did not move. He couldn't. The bedroom door stood wide open, revealing the darkened hallway beyond. And though he could see nothing, he could feel something waiting. Watching. His entire body screamed at him to run, to flee into the night, but where would he go? This thing, this presence, was not bound by walls or locked doors. It had found him before. It would find him again. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as his fingers tightened around the rusted knife he had bought the day before. As if a piece of metal could protect him from something that wasn't even solid. And then, the whispering returned. It was different now. Less noise, more voice. "Human. Come see." Daniel's stomach lurched. The words were clear, but they were wrong. They had no source. No depth. They weren't coming from the hallway. They weren't coming from inside the room. They were coming from inside his own skull. His grip on the knife trembled. "Come see," the voice repeated, gentle this time, almost kind. A whisper at the edge of sleep. A lullaby sung through broken teeth. His legs wanted to move. The hallway stretched before him, empty and quiet. Just a short walk to the front door. Just a dozen steps and he could be outside. But something deep in his bones told him that if he stepped past the threshold, if he crossed into that darkness, he would not be stepping into his apartment anymore. He would be stepping somewhere else. Somewhere wrong. The shadows in the hallway shifted, like the slow curling of fingers. He clenched his teeth, forcing his body to stay still. Do not listen. Do not move. But the whispering was insistent. "Come see. Come see. Come see." Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. No. 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 A single breath. The air went still. And then, something moved in the hallway. Not a shift of shadow, not a trick of the dim light. Something real. A figure. Not walking, not crawling, dragging itself forward. Slow. Unnatural. Wrong. Daniel's pulse slammed in his throat. His fingers clenched so tightly around the knife that his knuckles turned white. He should not be seeing this. He should not be listening. The whispering voice changed. It was no longer inviting. It was laughing. A thin, reedy chuckle, stretching through the air like stretched sinew, like brittle bones scraping together. Daniel's stomach clenched in horror. And then, the thing in the hallway lunged. He didn't think. He reacted. His hand shot out, slamming the door shut with all his strength. The instant it closed, the lights in the room burst, shattering in a pop of glass and smoke. Daniel stumbled backward, gasping, his ears ringing in the sudden, awful silence. And then, a single, slow knock against the other side of the door. Soft, patient, a mockery of politeness. Daniel's breath hitched. He clutched the knife to his chest like a lifeline, eyes locked on the door as the air shifted once more. And then, from the other side, the whispering voice spoke again. Closer, louder, inside his bones. "You shut the door, but I'm already inside." The air went silent, and behind him, something breathed. Daniel did not turn around. He couldn't. The breath behind him was slow, deliberate. He felt it ghost along the nape of his neck, colder than ice, heavier than shadow. His fingers clenched around the knife, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't matter. "You've been listening," the voice murmured, thick with something unnatural. "Now, it's time to understand." The room shifted. Not physically, but in some deeper, stranger way. The walls stretched. The floor sank beneath him. The air itself expanded, as if the space he stood in was no longer his apartment, no longer a place meant for human things. A sound slithered into his ears, low, pulsing, ancient. It wasn't random anymore. It wasn't static or broken whispers. It was language. And worse, he could almost understand it. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. No. 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 This was a dream. A hallucination. It had to be. He forced himself to move, one step forward, then another. The air felt thick, like pushing through water, but he reached the door. If he could just get out, just get out. But when he wrenched it open, he didn't see his apartment hallway. He saw endless black. Not darkness. Black. A void, stretching infinitely, rippling like the surface of a disturbed lake. And far, far below, something shifted in that abyss. Something big. Something waiting. Daniel slammed the door shut. His breath came ragged, his vision swimming. The whispering voice behind him laughed. "You think you can leave?" it said, closer now, almost inside him. The mirror. It was back on the wall. He didn't remember turning it around, but there it was, facing him. And in the glass, he saw himself. Only. It wasn't him. The reflection stared with wide, unblinking eyes. The same face, the same clothes, but its mouth was wrong. A little too wide. The lips twitching, as if trying to form a sound it wasn't meant to make. And then, the reflection moved. Daniel didn't. His stomach twisted in cold horror as his reflection stepped forward, pressing its palms against the inside of the glass. The whispering in his ears intensified. Not one voice anymore, many. Layered over each other. Ancient. Inhuman. The reflection's mouth opened. And Daniel finally understood the sound. Not words. Not speech. A name. His name. Being spoken backward. His vision blurred. The room spun. He felt himself being pulled forward, toward the mirror, toward the reflection that wasn't him, toward something beyond it. "No," he gasped. "No, no, no." But it was too late. The reflection smiled. And Daniel felt himself falling. Morning. The apartment was silent. The door stood open, the mirror cracked down the middle. A faint breath of static hummed in the air. Then, a single sound. A soft tap, tap, tap against the glass. And in the fractured reflection, Daniel smiled. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and leave a comment below. I love hearing your thoughts. If you're craving more mysteries, thrillers, and spine-chilling tales, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell, so you never miss out on the next chapter. The darkness is always waiting, and the next story could be just around the corner. See you in the next one, if you dare.